My name is Emily Carter, I'm 34 years old, and 3 months ago, I came home from a business trip to find that I no longer had a bedroom in my own house. I want to tell you this story from the beginning because I think a lot of you are going to recognize pieces of yourselves in it. Maybe not the exact details, but the feeling, that slow creeping realization that the people who are supposed to love you the most have quietly decided that your comfort doesn't matter as much as theirs. Let me back up. I met my husband Daniel 8 years ago at a marketing conference in Chicago. I was 26, ambitious, working my way up at a mid-sized advertising firm, and completely unprepared for how charming he was. Daniel had this easy confidence, the kind that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. We dated for 2 years, got engaged on a beach in North Carolina, and married in a small ceremony that my parents paid for because, frankly, neither of us had much money back then. Here's the thing about Daniel that I didn't fully understand until much later. He was, and still is, extremely close to his mother. Her name is Patricia. When we were dating, I thought it was sweet. He called her every Sunday. He remembered her birthday without being reminded. He'd drive 2 hours to fix her garbage disposal instead of just telling her to call a plumber. I thought, this is a man who knows how to love the people in his life. I didn't yet understand that with Daniel, loving his mother sometimes meant erasing me. We bought our house 6 years ago. It's a 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. I want to be very clear about something because it matters a lot for what happens later in this story. The down payment came almost entirely from my savings and a small inheritance I received when my grandmother passed away. Daniel contributed to the mortgage payments once we were both working, but the initial equity, the thing that got us into that house in the first place, was mine. I'm not saying this to be petty. I'm saying it because it's going to become very relevant. For the first 4 years our marriage was honestly pretty good. Not perfect, whose is? But good. We had our routines. Friday night takeout. Sunday morning coffee on the back porch. We talked about having kids eventually, though we hadn't started trying yet. I had my own room that I used as a home office since I worked remotely 2 days a week doing brand strategy consulting. It wasn't just a room. It was the one space in that entire house that was completely unapologetically mine. I'd painted the walls a soft sage green. I had my grandmother's old writing desk in there, the one piece of furniture I'd kept after she passed. I had a reading chair by the window where I did my morning journaling before Daniel woke up. That room meant something to me. I think everyone needs at least one space like that, one corner of the world that reflects who they actually are, not who they are to everyone else. For me, that room was it. Then, about a year and a half ago, Daniel's father passed away unexpectedly. Heart attack, very sudden, no warning at all. It was devastating, and I don't want anything I say in this story to diminish how genuinely painful that loss was for Daniel and for Patricia. I grieved with them. I flew to Pittsburgh for the funeral. I helped Patricia sort through some of her late husband's belongings. I did everything a supportive daughter-in-law is supposed to do. And I did it because I cared, not because I felt obligated. After the funeral, Patricia struggled. She'd been married to Daniel's father for 39 years, and suddenly she was alone in a house that echoed with his absence. Daniel started talking about her more, worrying about her more, driving out to see her almost every weekend. I supported that completely. I told him, go be with your mom, she needs you right now. About 6 months after the funeral, Daniel came to me with an idea. He said Patricia was having a hard time managing the house alone, that it was too big for her, too much upkeep, too many memories in every room. He suggested that maybe, just for a little while, she could come stay with us. Just until she got back on her feet. Just until she figured out her next steps. I want to be honest with you, I hesitated. Something in my gut told me this wasn't going to be temporary. But I also loved my husband, and I could see how much pain he was carrying. And I told myself that helping his mother through a hard time was the right thing to do, even if it wasn't convenient. So I said yes. Patricia moved in with a handful of suitcases and, she said, just a few boxes of essentials. The plan, as it was explained to me, was that she'd stay in our guest room while she looked for a smaller condo nearby. 90 days, Daniel said. Maybe less. I set up the guest room for her myself. New sheets, a little vase of flowers on the dresser, made sure the closet was cleared out. I wanted her to feel welcome, because despite everything, I did care about her and I understood grief. The first month was manageable. Patricia kept mostly to herself, watched a lot of television, and Daniel seemed relieved to have her close by. I told myself this was temporary, this was fine, this was the kind of sacrifice that marriages sometimes require. But 90 days came and went. I brought it up gently one evening while we were doing dishes. I asked Daniel if his mom had started looking at any condos. He got defensive almost immediately, said she was still grieving, said I was being insensitive by rushing her out the door. I remember feeling this small, sharp pang of guilt, like maybe I really was the bad guy for wanting my house back to some version of normal. Around month 4 is when things started to shift in a way I didn't expect. Patricia began very casually, mentioning that the guest room felt cramped, that the closet was too small for her wardrobe, that the guest bathroom, which she was sharing with any visitors, didn't have a bathtub, only a shower, and her knees weren't what they used to be. Small comments dropped here and there, the kind of thing you could brush off individually, but that started to form a pattern. Then one Tuesday evening, Daniel sat me down at the kitchen table with this look on his face that I now recognize as his "I've already decided this and I'm just informing you" look. He told me that he'd been thinking, and that it made more sense for his mom to have the master bedroom, since it had the ensuite bathroom with the tub, and that we could move into the guest room instead. I laughed at first because I genuinely thought he was joking. He wasn't. I said no. Clearly, calmly but firmly. I told him our bedroom was our bedroom, that his mother had a perfectly good guest room, and that if she needed a bathtub we could look into having one installed in the guest bathroom, or she could take baths at a gym membership, or honestly we could talk to her about finally getting her own place, which was supposed to have happened months ago. He didn't push it further that night. But I should have recognized that as round 1, not the end of the conversation. Over the next several weeks I started noticing changes. Small things at first. Patricia's decorative items appearing in shared spaces. A ceramic angel figurine on the living room mantel that definitely wasn't mine. A crocheted blanket draped over my reading chair. I didn't love it, but I told myself I was being small-minded. She'd lost her husband. Let her nest a little. Then I came home from a work trip to Denver 3 days, standard client presentation, and something felt different the second I walked through the front door. I want you to understand what it feels like to walk into your own home and immediately sense that something is wrong, before you can even articulate what it is. It's a specific kind of dread. I remember setting my suitcase down in the entryway, and just standing there for a second listening. The house smelled different. There was a scent of lavender potpourri that wasn't mine. I walked toward what should have been my home office, my sage green room, my grandmother's desk, my reading chair, and the door was closed. I opened it. It wasn't my room anymore. The sage green walls had been painted over. A soft pale yellow, the kind of color you choose for a guest room in a bed and breakfast. My grandmother's writing desk was gone. In its place was a queen-sized bed with a floral quilt I didn't recognize, a small television on a dresser, and a row of framed photographs of Daniel's father on the nightstand. My reading chair was gone too. There was a different armchair by the window, one that I now recognized from Patricia's old house. I stood in that doorway for what felt like a very long time, just processing. My office, my one space, had been completely converted into a bedroom for my mother-in-law while I was 3 states away, unable to say a word about it. I found Daniel in the kitchen and I asked him as evenly as I could manage where my desk was, where my chair was, why the walls were a different color. He told me, and I remember this almost word for word because it seared into my memory, that his mom's knees had gotten worse and going up and down the stairs to the guest room, which was on the 2nd floor, was becoming difficult for her. He said the home office was on the 1st floor, right next to the downstairs bathroom, and it just made more sense for her to be there. He said he'd been meaning to talk to me about it, but figured I'd understand once I saw how much easier it made things for her. He had made this decision, repainted a room, disassembled my workspace, moved my grandmother's desk somewhere I didn't even know, without discussing it with me. Without so much as a phone call while I was away. I asked him where my desk was. He said it was in the garage, wrapped in a moving blanket. My grandmother's desk. In the garage. Like storage. Like clutter. I want to pause here and say something important. This wasn't really about a room or a desk or paint color. This was about the fact that my husband had made a unilateral decision to erase the one space in our home that was mine, had done it behind my back while I was traveling for work, and expected me to simply accept it because his mother's comfort had, at some point without my noticing, become more important than mine. I didn't yell that night. I want to be honest about that because I know some of you are expecting me to say I lost it right there in the kitchen. I didn't. I was too stunned, honestly. I went out to the garage, unwrapped my grandmother's desk enough to make sure it wasn't damaged, and then I went to bed in what was now apparently our new bedroom, the old guest room upstairs, and I didn't sleep much at all. Over the next several days, I tried to talk to Daniel about it multiple times. Every conversation followed the same pattern. I'd explain how hurt I was, how disrespected I felt, how this wasn't just about square footage but about him making a major decision about our shared home without me. And every single time, he'd pivot the conversation to his mother's grief, his mother's needs, his mother's knees, his mother's loneliness. Anytime I tried to advocate for myself, I became the villain who didn't care that a recent widow was struggling. I want to be clear, I did care. I do care. Losing a spouse is one of the most painful things a person can go through, and I have never once dismissed Patricia's grief as unimportant. But grief doesn't give someone the right to occupy someone else's home and erase their space without consent. Compassion and boundaries are not opposites. You can hold both. About 3 weeks after I discovered what had happened to my office, things escalated again. I came home from work, a normal Wednesday, nothing unusual, and found moving boxes in the driveway. I thought maybe Patricia was finally moving into a condo, and for one brief, hopeful moment my chest actually loosened. I was wrong. The boxes weren't leaving. They were arriving. Inside, I found my brother-in-law, Ryan, Daniel's younger brother, carrying a duffel bag up the stairs. Ryan was 29 at the time, had recently gone through a messy breakup, lost his apartment lease in the process, and, as I would learn standing right there in my own front hallway, had been invited by Daniel to stay with us just for a bit while he got back on his feet. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had even mentioned it to me. I found out my brother-in-law was moving into my house because I watched him carry his belongings up my staircase. I remember standing there, keys still in my hand, coat still on, watching this unfold like some kind of out-of-body experience. My house, the house I had put my inheritance into, the house I had painted and decorated and built a life inside of, was quietly, steadily, being filled with people I hadn't agreed to live with, while pieces of my own identity within it were being packed into the garage. I confronted Daniel that night, and for the first time in our marriage, I said something I'd never said before. I told him this wasn't a marriage anymore, it was a hostel that I happened to be paying half the mortgage on. He got defensive, said Ryan needed help, family helps family, and didn't I want to be the kind of person who helps family? I said, of course I do. But you're not asking me to help family. You're deciding unilaterally over and over again to give away pieces of our shared life without ever once considering how it affects me. There's a difference between helping someone and being steamrolled without a say. He didn't have a good answer for that. He just repeated that it was temporary, that everyone was going through a hard time, that I needed to be more patient. I want to walk you through the weeks that followed because I think the small details matter as much as the big ones. Ryan, it turned out, worked nights at a distribution warehouse and slept most of the day, which meant the television was often on downstairs during hours I used to have quiet for my remote work calls. Patricia took over the kitchen most mornings, which meant my usual routine of coffee and journaling in what used to be my sage green office was now impossible, because that space belonged to someone else, and honestly, showing up there uninvited felt like trespassing in my own home. I started working from a coffee shop 3 days a week just to have somewhere quiet to think. I started noticing that grocery bills had roughly doubled, but nobody was offering to contribute. I started noticing that Daniel, who used to ask me how my day was every single evening without fail, had started coming home and immediately gravitating toward his mother and brother, catching up with them, while I sat slightly outside the circle of conversation in my own living room. I felt like a guest in a house I had helped buy. I felt like an inconvenience in a marriage I had built for 8 years. I tried one more time to have a real conversation with Daniel. This was about 2 months after Ryan moved in, so 5 months total since Patricia had first arrived. I sat him down and I laid it all out as calmly as I possibly could. I told him I loved him. I told him I understood that his family was going through hard things. But I told him that a marriage requires 2 people making decisions together, and that for the past several months, he had been making unilateral decisions that reshaped our entire home and our entire life, and had done so without once asking how it affected me. I asked him for a timeline, a real one. When was Patricia moving into her own place? When was Ryan getting back on his feet? I told him I needed actual dates, not vague reassurances. He got angry. He said I was being cold, that I was treating his family like a burden, that a good wife would understand that family comes first sometimes. That sentence, family comes first sometimes, is the moment something in me went quiet and still. Because I realized with total clarity that in his mind I wasn't family. Or at least I wasn't family in the way that mattered. His mother and his brother were family. I was something else. Some kind of resource. Some kind of infrastructure that was supposed to hold the house together while everyone else's needs took priority. I didn't argue with him that night. I just said okay and I went upstairs. But something had shifted permanently. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly gathering information. I pulled our mortgage documents and confirmed, in writing, exactly how much of the down payment had come from my inheritance. I talked to a lawyer friend of mine, off the record, just to understand my options. I didn't tell Daniel any of this. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was simply, for the first time in months, thinking clearly about what I actually wanted, instead of just absorbing whatever was happening to me. And here's what I realized. Sitting in that coffee shop that had basically become my second office. I didn't want to fight for a house that no longer felt like mine. I didn't want to fight for a marriage where my needs were treated as optional. I wanted more than anything to feel like a priority to at least one person in my own life again. So I made a decision. I booked a 2-week stay at my best friend Rachel's guest cottage, about 40 minutes away. I quietly arranged for a moving company to come while Daniel was at work and Patricia and Ryan were both out. Patricia at a doctor's appointment, Ryan at his overnight shift, sleeping during the day but out running errands that particular afternoon. Packed my clothes. I packed my grandmother's desk, still wrapped in that moving blanket from the garage, and had the movers loaded up with the same careful hands I would have used myself. I packed my reading chair replacement, a few boxes of books, my important documents, and honestly not much else because most of what filled that house at that point didn't feel like mine anymore anyway. And then I wrote a note. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had first told me his mother was taking my bedroom, the same table where he told me family comes first sometimes, and I wrote him a letter. I'm going to share most of what it said because I think it captures everything I couldn't say out loud without being talked over or dismissed. I wrote, Daniel, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not forever necessarily, but for now because I need space to think clearly, which I haven't been able to do in this house for months. I want you to understand that this isn't about your mother, and it isn't about Ryan. I don't blame either of them for needing help. I blame you because you are my husband and somewhere over the last 5 months, you decided that their comfort mattered more than mine over and over again without ever once asking me how I felt or what I needed. You took my office. You gave away my space without discussing it. You invited your brother to live here without a conversation. You told me family comes first sometimes, and I understood finally that in your mind I'm not part of that family, not in the way that counts. I put my inheritance into this house. I put 8 years into this marriage. And somewhere along the way I became furniture.